screen. There you go. Continue. You can continue if you're okay with it. I think that's a new Zoom feature these days. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Alrighty. All right, so welcome. You're in the right place if you were wanting to join Riparian Forest Buffers and hearing about Virginia Tech's Catawba Sustainability Center. I'm going to get you started with just some introductions about buffers and why we love them so much at James River Association. And then you're going to hear from John Munsell, who's a professor and forest management extension specialist at Virginia Tech, as well as Adam Taylor, who is the manager of the Catawba Sustainability Center. So most of you know who JRA is, but just a real quick snapshot. We are a nonprofit, and our mission is to protect the James and connect people to the James. And the area that we are focused on is the watershed, which is in green on the map. And we do our work through 4 A's: awareness, appreciation, action, and advocacy. And I head up our restoration program. I'm the Senior Watershed Restoration Manager. And so that could be from riparian forest buffer projects to living shorelines to stormwater. So to get started on the topic of the evening, we're talking about riparian forest buffers. And some folks, this might be a new term. So just so that we're all on the same page, a riparian forest buffer is that area along a stream, a lake, the river, that contains a combination of trees, shrubs, or other perennial plants. And it's really one of the best ways to improve water quality. So there's an image that kind of gives you an idea. These forested areas along our banks help filter runoff that might be coming from farms or agricultural uses or urban landscapes. And that picture at the bottom is a site near Scottsville along the banks of the James. And it really clearly shows that area of vegetation that we're really talking about, those wonderful forest buffers right along the banks of our waterways. So some of the problems across the James watershed, you can see here in the photos, and something we're making great progress on, especially our partners with the soil and water conservation districts, by fencing out cattle. But there's still a lot of cattle in our streams that are a problem, as you can see in those photos. And even in our urban landscapes where folks love to mow the grass right up to the edge of those streams. So we are facing some issues across the watershed with lack of riparian forest buffers. And I'll go over a few top reasons why we love forest buffers, and I'll put a link to this. This is actually from Stroud Water Research Center in Pennsylvania. They give kind of their top reasons why riparian buffers are so awesome. One is that they lead to cleaner streams with better water quality. And we all know that we depend on water for life. It's our drinking water for many of us in the James River watershed, and it's where a ton of us like to spend time. Another reason is that this one is something a lot of people don't realize, but healthier stream ecosystems better able to process pollution. So basically, streams that have grass buffers aren't as good at even providing that in-stream quality. So there's some stats up there. Streams bordered by forests are up to 2 to 8 times more effective than those with grass borders in processing important substances like excess nitrogen. Because if you can imagine streams going through forested areas, they're also getting all of the leaf litter that's falling off the trees, and there's a whole ecosystem happening in the water there that's helping to clean water even more. It's able to support things like mussels that also are cleansing the water. So basically, clean water leads to cleaner water. And number 3 is it's better habitat for aquatic life. If there's any fishermen in the room, fisherwomen as well, brook trout are a great thing for a lot of folks. And they depend on cool streams. And that's an image that just kind of shows you that areas where they have these kind of consistent vegetated corridors there's more trout populations, and where there's gaps, they don't see as much. And the fourth one is enhanced property values, which could be benefits to farms. Nobody wants to lose the land that they are stewarding and caring so much for. And forest buffers really help to stabilize those banks. And that's a picture down on the left. We did a buffer project at a local brewery in Scottsville, and adding those streams along the banks created a beer garden for folks to hang out in. So there's lots of different ways that buffers and trees along our creeks can enhance property values. And then the last one is improved recreation and human health benefits. There's a ton of research out there around how special these places are along water, especially when there's trees around, how important those are to our mental health, and who doesn't need a little bit of that these days. So that's something we personally love about buffers as well. And then in terms of the Chesapeake Bay cleanup plan and the James River and buffers related to that, we have a big goal in the James. It's 70,000 acres of riparian forest buffers that are called for by 2025. We have a long ways to go. Based on 2019 numbers, we're 11% of the way there. We're waiting to hear how we did in 2020, but we know we still have a long ways to go. Now I'm going to pass it over to Adam and John, who are going to show you some awesome stuff that they are doing down at the Catawba Sustainability Center, just outside of Roanoke in the Upper James Watershed. You should be able to share your screen, either John or Adam.
Hello, Amber. Hi. Am I upside down?
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay.
That's great.
So nothing like starting a presentation with egg on your face and it's actually falling off this way. I have a new computer, folks. I'm sorry. It was just working on Google Meets where Adam and I jumped on, assuming that's where the meeting was going to be. So a little bit of a rocky start here. And because in the interest of time, I'm not going to try and fiddle around with my settings anymore. I'm just going to go ahead and stop video. That's great because I've got a lot of cool imagery to show you, kind of cover, you know, oh, I'm sorry. Maybe if you can mute, that would help to reduce ambient noise. But I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and then I'll share my screen and get started on my presentation because trust me, the pictures are a lot better to look at than me upside down. Okay, can someone confirm that you are able to see my slides?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yes, so thank you everyone for the opportunity to be with you this evening. Adam and I am excited to kind of share a lot of the work that we've been involved with at the Catawba Sustainability Center, which is appropriately and very clearly aligned with what the James River Association is focusing on and some of the projects that Amber and others are leading. So great little intersection this evening. And we are going to talk about riparian buffers at Virginia Tech's Catawba Sustainability Center. And you can see the Sustainability Center there. It's a near 380 acre property. And Adam's going to go into much more detail about all the different projects and activities that are ongoing on the farm. But we're also going to jump a little bit outside of the riparian buffer zone as well, and thinking about some of our first line of defense plantings that we've also been looking at with respect to contour tree planting. And you can see some of that in the bottom portion of the image. And I'm with Forest Resources and Environmental Conservation at Virginia Tech, and Adam is with Outreach and International Affairs, which has the Catawba Sustainability Center in its portfolio. All right, so I don't know how many of you have heard of agroforestry before, but I will provide a brief overview for those of you that haven't, or it's a little bit hazy for some that maybe have heard the term but don't necessarily know all the ins and outs. And then talk about multifunctional riparian buffers and contour plantings, which fall, at least the way we're working with them, under the larger umbrella of agroforestry. And then I'll turn it over to Adam, who will talk about some of the history, kind of the backstory of the Catawba Sustainability Center, some of the different activities that are underway, and provide some perspective on plantings that he's managing that are both buffer-based, but also upslope in the contour areas, using trees and shrubs for both production purposes, food and fiber, those types of things, but also conservation, ecosystem services. And then I'll come back and provide some perspective on lessons and opportunities and tools that have kind of stemmed from some of our work together on the farm, and then we can open it up for Q&A. So agroforestry, what is it? Technically defined, it's an intensive and holistic land management practice that optimizes the benefits, and optimize is critical here because we're talking about combining trees, crops, and or livestock in the same place. So, resources are finite, and there's always competition for those resources. And so when you start to integrate multiple species into the same place, you have to think about optimizing those systems so that you can achieve and continue to achieve a level of production regarding food and fiber, while also achieving some of these important environmental services. And what does it take? Well, it's adaptive. There's no doubt. I mean, when you're starting to mimic a multi-species ecosystem, you're managing trees, shrubs, crops, livestock potentially all together in the same place. You've got to keep your eye on that, and that requires adaptation over time. And then because we're talking about trees and crops and livestock and all of those things together, I mean, we have to think about interdisciplinary teamwork. I think we all know, defined ourselves in terms of these silos regarding, oh, I'm an ag person, or I'm a forestry person, or I'm a livestock person, and we have our own departments, and so we're kind of split naturally, but we have to think about that teamwork. And then what that does is help us balance production and ecosystem services by basically leveraging that knowledge and expertise base together to manage these dynamic systems. And really, when I think about it, or we can think about it, is we've got that distinct boundary, and we often think about our farmland and our forest land in that regard, right? Forest land's over here, farmland's over here, other side. But what we're doing is we're taking what we know about managing trees and pulling that into the agricultural space. And we're also thinking about, the farming proposition and what that means in terms of how we can manage for non-timber products in our forest lands. So it's not a single tree in a field. And it's not going out to the woodlands and harvesting in the wild growing populations of much of the non-timber plants or fungi that you can get your hands on. It really is about blending these things together. It's about trees, like I've mentioned, in the crops, managing those things in the same space. And you can do that in the field, as you just saw, or you can do that under the canopy of a woodland, where you have shade obligate species that have markets, right, that have benefits, medicinal products, edible products. You can also gather those things out of the woods, basically cultivate them. So it looks like something along these lines, a silvopasture, where you have a nice forage base, you've got cattle, you've got trees being managed in the same space, and then nice stand of golden seal. Or what we see here in Cameroon, which is the intercropping of Caliandra with maize. That's a nitrogen fixing tree. And so they intercrop that with the maize, and that's an agroforestry system. You have your tree and your crop together, they're being managed simultaneously. Or windbreaks. Maybe you're familiar with windbreaks. One of the more popular, well-known agroforestry practices in the Midwest. That's also essentially the blending that I'm talking about. And so get it all out of the way, which is good to know, kind of the universe of agroforestry options. We also think about multifunctional riparian buffers. That does fall under the umbrella. And by that, what we mean is that there are multiple things happening, multiple benefits associated with those buffers. So the agroforester doesn't just think about the buffer as an area where you want to plant perennial crops, but where you plant perennial crops and the species that are selected also provide agricultural opportunities. So here we see hydrangea planted along the Catawba Creek at the Catawba Sustainability Center. And so that's a marketable floral crop on a perennial species that's providing all the ecosystem services that we want in our wooded riparian buffers. But at the same time, on top of that, you have a production opportunity. And I'd just like to note too that it's not just rural areas where agroforestry is playing out, and buffers also too in the multifunctional sense, but also increasingly in towns and cities. And that's one thing that's nice about agroforestry. It can be scaled, right? It can be in the backyard, or it can be on a 1,000-acre farm. It can also be in a park. And there are examples across the country where people have planted fruit and nut trees in a community food forest, and they've also integrated those plantings into riparian areas to try and protect and maintain, some water quality through a water body moving in that urban area. So at the end of the day, it's really about diversification and whole farm planning. It's about whole property management. It's about what you can do across a landscape, not what you can't do. And we have this fancy term polyculture. All that means is it's not a monoculture, which would be one crop, but it's combining, integrating. And you can see that across the landscape here at Catawba. And I love to throw this quote up from a student of mine in 2012. It's in the agroforestry class, which I teach at Virginia Tech. Said, if you can't do one thing, you can always do something else. And that, I kind of alluded to that in the earlier slide. It's about positive feedbacks. It's about asking yourself what you can do across a landscape as opposed to, restricting in certain ways. All right, so let's land at the multifunctional riparian buffer in the agroforestry sense. And of course, very important to the organization and folks that have joined the webinar is, how to take a landscape that looks something like this, exposed creek bank, not a lot of shading, not a lot of detritus. So you have some habitat issues, you've got stabilization issues, obviously too, you have runoff issues happening. How do you take this particular area of land and kind of move through a sequence of time? And now we might fast forward, say, 5 or 6 years here. That's actually more like 3-4 years following planting along that same creek bank to getting to something like this, which is also the same creek bank 8 years hence. So this is what we see at the Catawba Creek, again, at the Sustainability Center. And I don't know if Amber mentioned, but there is a workshop upcoming, maybe you know about that, where you can tour on site and learn about in person some of the activities that we've been involved in. Well, how do you do that? Well, why would we do that? I guess maybe that's the most important question to ask first. And really, it's because we know that farms and pasture land contribute an awful amount in terms of nitrogen and phosphorus into surface waters. 65% annually is the estimate. But we also know that buffers, across a series of studies, we can see a range of 60 to 95% in terms of the effectiveness in retaining nitrogen, at least in this example. Phosphorus is a little bit different in terms of its legacy issues. However, putting trees along the creek bank can be a good thing. But there is a catch because these are dynamic systems. They're not static. It's not like a set it and forget it kind of thing. Just plant the trees and all is good. And not just the trees or the buffer area, but the entire kind of aquatic and terrestrial ecosystem at that interface is very dynamic. And that has, a lot of dynamic activity in terms of the biophysical attributes and behaviors, but also the human. And that's really kind of the, point I want to drive home in terms of what we're doing at Catawba. We're both looking at the relationships of, the tree plantings, both along the creek side and upslope, and water quality and other issues related to that interrelationship and what it means from the beneficial aspects of ecosystem services, primarily with respect to water quality and water quantity. But we're also keeping an eye on the human systems because those are also dynamic. And so when you think about managing an area, we have to think about both of those being at play at the same time. And, kind of the status quo has been to work in terms of right along the creek side for some stabilization and shading and those types of things. And there's nothing wrong with a buffer system that's pretty uniform, that runs along the side of a creek, a waterway at a fixed distance. You can see up in the upper right corner there, an illustration of a uniform riparian buffer. And that's really been kind of the status quo or defining the approach for many years. And some of our standards are based around that, a certain fixed distance from, the creek side. But what we need to know is that in terms of that dynamism or what's happening in those areas, that it's not uniform necessarily. And that has some implications that we'll cover in a little bit regarding how we're approaching and have approached some of the work at Catawba and beyond. One of those two would be to consider just generally that, there is width matters. I mean, if you have particular objectives, the buffer width in terms of what we see with respect to the research shows that, certain widths are better at addressing particular issues versus maybe some of those that are more compressed. So if we think about that kind of uniform 30-foot or 35-foot buffer, you might not be getting into as much of nutrient control and sediment control benefits or flood control that you would like to. And the agroforestry model is actually one that extends out farther than the typical kind of cost share or baseline, we might say, baseline conservation width. And so we think about different zones. I mean, right along the creek bank, we have to have the unmanaged forest because that's, really a critical area for protecting water quality. But to continue and expand out and increase the benefits, we can move into these different zones, and these different zones have opportunities because we're moving laterally away from the water body to build in production, right? To create that agroforestry balance between production and conservation. In contour farming, upslope, first line of defense too, can also help in terms of controlling water flow and also filtration. So if we look at Catawba here, we can see the Catawba Creek annotated kind of running through the farm. That's the old 311 route you see. The new one is down at the bottom. You might start to pick out some of the different rows of trees that we've planted. But one thing important to note is that before any of those things were established, and this goes back to kind of the idea that uniformity is not necessarily how we need to think about these particular these projects, is that we had two pathways of flow for water out of that field upslope on that hill, and they were not uniform. They were basically channeled, and so that's a legacy effect in terms of the landscape topography. And so if we look closer, we can see that what we've done is we have established a buffer in kind of a conventional uniform sense along the creek, but we also have upslope planting with contour, on contour, using some strategies developed out of the permaculture field. And what that does is essentially, and actually that first image I showed you just kind of brought that in, of the mulberry intercrop with chestnut. I mean, that's what you're looking at over on the left side of that contour area. So I guess at the end, we have, two systems kind of working together, and buffers is our focus today, but it's important to note that upslope, there are also other activities. However, why do I throw up the question mark? Because if you're a farmer and you just look at the shaded areas, you're asking yourself, that's a lot of trees being put into the areas where I could farm. So, what's the rub here? How does this work? And that's where the agroforestry model, again, comes into play. Species selection is critical. We can select for native fruit-producing trees, which provide a product. Native nut-producing trees. So we've got our mass trees that can be selected, but also our floral species, and even potentially some livestock, upslope and utilizing the beneficial aspects of shade from those trees to enhance production in that system. But, those are the conventional products. And I now toss up phosphorus and nitrogen because we do have ecosystem services markets that are coming online where, there are some opportunities because of tree planting, because of shrub planting, to take advantage of some of the trading possibilities around phosphorus and nitrogen and even carbon sequestration. So throw those out there just to let you know that the complexities of the kind of agroforestry model are actually leveraged to become benefits in terms of how those systems are designed. And those systems lead to these multiple benefits. So they enhance natural capital and they mimic diverse ecosystems, right? So forests are our best and highest use when it comes to protecting water quality in a natural sense. And, so why not try to create agricultural systems that mimic those diverse ecosystems a little bit more closely? You got the conservation, health, air, water quality benefits. A lot of stuff has been demonstrated regarding integrating trees at low densities into the farming space. And we have networking across fences, social capital, thinking about managing the water quality, which cuts across, boundaries without problem, ecosystem services, no political boundaries. And then increasing human capital by reducing barriers, land class production, but aesthetics and energy efficiency are also important. And then lastly, buffering operations through diversification and differentiation is important because you have multiple streams of production happening. So you can lean on one when one is slim during one year and vice versa. And the latest estimates are the U.S. there's 2% of farms that practice some form of agroforestry. So not a lot. And we're working on that, I think. And I do believe there are an increasing base of producers that are interested in how these systems will work. However, I'll get into later a little bit of some of the challenges regarding establishment. But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share and turn it over to Adam so he can dive into some details regarding what you see here in the schematic in terms of the practices and the projects and such at Catawba. So thanks. I'll be back.
Well, thanks, John. So yeah, my name's Adam Taylor. I manage the Catawba Sustainability Center as part of Outreach International Affairs. The farm is an interesting little piece of something that Virginia Tech has. We're probably the only interdisciplinary farm in the whole university portfolio. We're working with professors like John and College of Natural Resources and Environment. We work with in our College of Agricultural Life Sciences. We're working with our College of Science. We're even doing some stuff in the College of Liberal Arts on historical research. And yeah, so it's a beautiful place where we all come together and collect and learn together. I will give you a disclaimer. I am in Catawba currently, and it's a rural area and we don't have the best internets. And so if I cut out or freeze, I hope someone will let me know. And there is a farmer's market going on under my feet right now. So if there's any weird noises, that's what that is. So yeah, we've seen this picture. It's our favorite picture of the farm. But who we are, we're a 377 acre living and learning environment for research and demonstration. So everything we do is on a sustainable model. We say, doing things now that provide for the future. One of the better definitions that I've come to know recently is that we're putting twice as much back as we're taking from the land, and we do that in a lot of different ways. But we try to involve community and university and state and local and everybody. We're just not limited to the university. So our three-word catchphrase is innovate, collaborate, sustain. We are trying out new things. I think a lot of the times we say they're new, but they're often older practices that people did prior agricultural industrialization. So we're bringing them back or innovating into new ways, using new technologies as well to kind of assess our impact on the land. As I said, we're collaborating with lots of different folks. We do have a rich partnership with Roanoke County, the county in which the farm is located, and they help us out in a lot of infrastructure development. We work on some rural entrepreneurship things. And then, yeah, we collaborate with this group, with the Virginia Department of Forestry, local nonprofits. It goes on and on and on. And then, yeah, sustain, right? With the Sustainability Center. So we have to have sustain. We already mentioned what that's about. This is kind of like a 5-year kind of layout of the farm map. And I can go through some of this real quick. I guess the main thing to take away from this picture is that we're highly diversified, and in a mountain farm situation like we are here on the edge of Southwest Virginia, diversified farm, multi-layered, is about the only way you can kind of make an income farming. Our farms aren't big, like maybe in the Shenandoah Valley or out in the east or out on the shore. We're confined by contour, mountains, hollers, you name it. And so if we're not multi-layered and diversified, I think it's hard for a small scale farmer to make it. Now, the Catawba's farm is bigger than most farms in the area are, being as large as it is, but we try to mimic what a small farm would be. And so up at the top here, one of our things is we do grass finished beef here. It's part of a project. We run steers. We have about a herd of 20 head, and we use them in kind of innovative ways because the cows are something that farmers in the area can kind of latch on to. It's like they know cows, people keep cows. When they see cows doing weird things, they seem to pay attention more. So we have a highly intensive rotational system, stream exclusion. Our cows have never even been in the creek. And then we're using different types of grasses and grazing different times of years, just trying to, maximize our nutrient input on the land, and building organic matter and building our soils, using the cows more as like a tool. And the byproduct of it is that we're supporting local farmers by buying calves from farmers who practice stream exclusion and planting buffers, and we give them a higher value for their weaned steers and then bring them to the farm. and we grass finish them out, and then they go into low-income neighborhoods or to the Catawba Hospital, which is across the road. You can see some of our other agroforestry things, silver pasture research, that's been planted. John mentioned that with the cows grazing under the trees. Ours is budding. We put cows in it the first time last year, just in some strips, and then we had some calves out here, let them, we call it creep graze. They could get below the fence and then kind of eat because they weren't too big to damage some of the trees. Over here is the area John was mentioning in his slides. Across 311 there, we also have another buffer, but we've done some wetland restoration as part of our water quality efforts. Our water quality for us is important, and for this group, because we're in the headwaters of the James River. So we're like right at the beginning before it comes, down the pike to you guys. And so we were able to trap in our wetland restoration project, we were able to trap road runoff and run it through a system of vernal pools using a lot of different tree species like swamp oaks and willows and lindens and sycamores to try to uptake any nutrients that might have been a runoff, let them sit in this ephemeral wetland area before draining into the creek. And it's a labor of love, but it's still happening. We do a lot of crop research. I mean, we're growing for entomology studies, biological studies on leaf matter. We're also doing community outreach programs like a small farm incubator program where we give people access to land who want to start or expand an agricultural business, mostly around organic vegetable farming. We do a lot of non-timber forest products up in the woods. You can see we have mushroom production going on, and then we're doing a lot around golden seal and ginseng and black cohosh and ramps. We're also part of the national effort to back cross the American chestnut tree. We have a chestnut orchard where we're planting nuts that fall from trees and hoping to achieve the 1516 cross for the, to bring back the American chestnut. And then we're also doing some recreation. As you can see, we have a blue blaze trail that goes through the farm, and that connects to the Appalachian Trail. So if you've, if you're familiar with the Appalachian Trail, we're kind of in the cradle of McAfee's Knob and Dragon's Tooth and Tinker Cliffs, which is called the Triple Crown for this area. And McAfee's on the whole trail from Maine to Georgia is one of the most photographed spots. And so we try to incorporate some of that into what we're doing, and then bring all that into education for people visiting the farm and see what we're doing, and know that our model is not your typical farm that you're going to see in the valley. So that's probably way too much that y'all needed. So we'll get into buffers. So yeah, as John mentioned, I think our buffer model out here is all multifunctional zones, multifunctional improved riparian buffers. Most of the tree species are good for something, either edible or medicinal or fiber. And yeah, I'll just get right into them. So one of the first ones we'll look at is a variable width buffer. This one's interesting because if you've ever been involved with the NRCS cost share program for stream exclusion, if you have livestock, the standard buffer width is 35 feet. And the contour of the land doesn't really lay like that. Given how your farm lays, there's going to be wetter spots here, drier spots near the creek. And what I think you're going for is stream stabilization and maximum absorption of nutrient runoff before it reaches the creek. And that might mean you fertilize or your cows are right there, but anything that's flowing downhill, having that buffer to kind of protect to something and go through it before it hits the creek is good. And so John will talk a little bit about a program a little bit later on, but looking at the contour of the farm and then how the wet area is set during rain events, this area in particular was a much wetter area, and it could also be established as a wetland. Just a little bit above it up in this area, there are wetland grasses that are growing right now. We've been protecting them, and like they've been hayed or grazed in the past, but we're kind of mowing around them and letting them grow up until eventually we can maybe try to restore another wetland there. But some of these species aren't multifunctional. They're just really good wet species because they're in a wet area like bald cypress and sycamore. But then we have the black walnut, of course, which is rising in popularity among people wanting to eat black walnuts, and they're making lots of value-added products with black walnuts. They're also kind of medicinal in their own way. And river birch, also slippery elm type things. The bark is medicinal quality that you can pull from that. So if we come down the buffer, we come into more of a fixed width kind of look at things. And these are all in rows. And this is elderberries, which we know are good for a lot. And I'll show you some of the stuff that we've done experimenting with them. And then persimmons and mulberry. Elderberry, great medicinal, even tastes great as a syrup. And the flowers, you can do stuff with the flowers and the berry itself. Persimmons are wonderful if you like persimmons. And then yeah, mulberry, a wonderful early kind of berry fruit. So this is that buffer during the winter. You can see kind of the variable width section here. And then as we move into the fixed width rows right here. So we did a lot of experiments when we established this buffer on tree establishment. And so in this area, what we did when we planted it was we just kind of scuffed our boot in the size of the tree shelter and planted the tree with a dibble bar, put the shelter on, let it roll. As you move into this side, this was a broadcast glyphosate or Roundup spray that we eliminated all herbaceous competition and then planted into that. As we move out through here, we did a couple other techniques where we did like an actual plow and till like you would in a garden bed, but on contour with the creek, and then planting in that loose soil to see if it would aid in early root developments. And then the Department of Forestry let us borrow a scalper, which is I have a picture of it out here somewhere, which is where we can kind of run this machine through and it flips both sides of the soil over on either side and creates a ditch. And so that's taking the weed seed bank and putting it over on either side and giving you clean soil to plant into. And given that, I mean, we didn't have any weeds in there for the first season until others, seeds kind of blew in and took over. This is what that buffer looks like today. I took this picture this morning as I was going to cultivate a field. And you can see the trees are, it's messy, right? I mean, it's like, you don't think about early establishment, you want to, like nice orchard looking thing. It's messy, but if you look in here, these little grasses that are coming up here it's a big blue stem, a warm native season grass. And this is the area that wasn't sprayed that we're looking at nearest to us. And so that big blue stem is interesting because the trees kind of burst in the spring when it's wet and they send their roots further down, they're collecting lots of water, and then they need all the energy they can get to push their leaves out. And their leaves get out and they kind of just hang out for the summer. And at that time, the warm season grasses don't come online till around this time of year. This time of year, they're only, I don't know, they're getting to be about 12 inches tall out here. And so they're kind of keeping the ground covered and holding the nutrients in, and their roots go really deep, and they're benefiting while the trees are kind of resting. So it's a good symbiotic relationship that I believe they have with each other. A lot of people will want to, like, you need to go through and mow. And, we did do, and you'll see some examples where we do finish mow around. And that's mostly because we're at the university and we have visitors and we can't, people come visit, you don't want to get ticks, but we do leave these areas alone just to demonstrate that. So across the bridge, we have another similar model where we have two different variable widths. So you can see that we didn't think we needed as much absorption here as we did here and across and down, again with a fixed width, and some of them are similar species. And that's what that buffer looks like from the aerial. So here's some of the land prep techniques that we were talking about. The top right photo is what the scalp does. You can see it on the back of the tractor in the bottom right, but that's kind of what it looks like just after it's run through. Creates these berms, which the seed bank is in, and then the trees go directly in the middle. This was an interesting one we did, which we've, it's been good in some ways. It's come back to bite us in others. We planted all those elderberries in these weed mats. And it was good because elderberries really, struggle with the weeds in their early establishment because they're, kind of small for the first few years. But then we created habitats for voles. And so the voles came underneath and started girdling to get moisture and bark out of a lot of the elderberries and killed some of them. We lost almost like an entire row. I mean, they're doing well now that the ones that did survive get up, but we kind of created a weird habitat trying to save the elderberries. And then like maintenance of these systems, I'm always back and forth. This is maybe not scientific, but more of like an observation. When we finish mow, like down to the, maybe 3 inches of grass that we leave, we're leaving a lot of room for bacterial infection and the diseases to come in. And also we're not feeding our trees a lot through the organic matter. So I think in the first 3 years of a tree establishment, it does need that intense kind of maintenance on it and making sure that the tree is the only thing. But after 3 years, it's developed pretty good roots. You want to start feeding it. So what I do is like, I only really mow once a month, and I do it with like a bush hog. So it's like we're growing lots of grass that we then just chop up and leave on the ground that breaks down and then just goes into the soil to feed the trees. So, another model that you could do, I have another small farm that me and my wife operate, and we do a lot of buffers and orchards and things like that. We run chicken tractors through them. And, we're carrying water. Chickens aren't getting in the stream or anything, but they are, they're amazing at keeping the grass maintained, and as well as putting down a fixed amount of nitrogen. And I've had like rabbit problems where they have also girdled trees, and there's been like one little sliver of bark coming up the tree from the rabbit doing it. But because they had access to so much nutrients through those chicken tractors, that they were able to hold on and survive and make it to the next year. So I mean, when you have good nutrition for the trees, I think that's very important for, them being established. This is another buffer. It's kind of a little tighter. This is a tree tube study that we've done with Tubex for the tree shelters, where we're monitoring how trees do in a closed tube as opposed to a vented tube, as opposed to no tube at all. Just from early observations, if we're worried about shelters, which I think are important, the no tube at all is like, man, you're going to get a lot of deer pressure. I mean, it depends on where you're at, but it's easy to lose the tree in the weeds. It's the deer are just going to gobble it up. And then I've noticed between the solid tube and the vented tube is like the solid tube gives you like a spindly tree until it can get out of that tube and get the sunlight that it needs out of the top. It's like it's blocked off from like the wind and the weather. So it doesn't really develop like a hardiness that I think that it might need. And this is good, again, purely observational. And then with the vented tube, it does get the wind and the weather and the cold a little bit more. And it seems to be a hardier stake that it gets from that. Tubes are amazing. They do a lot of different things. We experiment with 2 different types, a plantra and a tubex. Each one is different and has its own benefits. I do know if you're going to maintain tubes like areas a lot by mowing or something like we do out here, the wooden stakes after about 3 to 4 years tend to dry rot in the ground. And if you bump that with a mower or your bush hog, it will break off, and then you're replacing where the plantra has a fiberglass tube stake, which I find a little bit better, but I like Tubex's tube better and its system better. I just wish it had that fiberglass stake. This is a different model of a riparian food forest. Now these are all edible or medicinal. It's in a weird spot in the farm right next to the creek, right between the creek and the old 311. It's almost an acre. And this one we keep very maintained as like a community gathering area. We finish mow it and stuff, but it has a lot of different variety, black walnut, willow, buttonbush, Swiss hazel, persimmons, elderberry, serviceberry, hazelnuts. I mean, it's a lot of things in there, but we maintain it for the tree. So there's like paths and stuff that you can, finish mow that you walk through. It's a nice place to have a picnic or something if you're walking down. I'll just go ahead and show you a picture of it. There's a lot of different stories of trees, big persimmons, big black walnuts, and then you get some smaller elderberries or some witch hazels there in the back, the pawpaws. It's just, a really nice model and a really great place for all these fruits and things to drop and collect and do it kind of in a community kind of gathering area. Yeah, we finish mow this just because it looks nice and we like to maintain the area for people, but it doesn't have to be, it could be bush hogged, but given the sporadic planting of not in rows, it makes it a little harder to bush hog. than it would like a row planted buffer. And then we call them the woody florals. John hit on the hydrangeas. You saw some pictures of them, and they're off on the other side of the creek from the riparian forest buffer. And then it's just a lot of woody floral species: red twig dogwood, viburnum, pussy willow, sweet shrub, callianthus, hydrangea, red twig dogwood, yellow twig dogwood. And these are beautiful species just to have on your farm. I know what we do with them because most of them are coppicing species. You can cut and plug. You cut them off in the spring, and then if you want to replant them somewhere, you just stick them in the ground. And they've been really great when we have flooding times and maybe some of our stream gets washed out. What we'll go do is go cut a bunch of red twig dogwood and pussy willow, and we'll just stick them in the stream and then just try to give, whatever eroded out, we'll go ahead and put it there to go ahead and let's get some more growth going. And they're beautiful, and they come for get a high dollar at floral markets. I know we can't really sell anything at Catawba, but again, where we are involved in the community, I have a few friends that are forest farmers that live around. I mean, florist, like cut flower kind of farms, and I'll call them when they're at peak, and they'll come down and cut a bunch and put in their arrangements, and they really love it, and they're always like, "Are they ready yet?" Now that I've got them on. So yeah. So they're beautiful. Here's some pictures of them. And the one on the left is hydrangea. You can kind of see across of the rows looking at it. And then my favorite of them all is the callianthus. This little scarlet flower on here will hold a bloom well into like July, from May until July. It's just a sturdy, steady woody floral that you can keep cutting for a long time and keep using. As far as like the early establishment from the coppicing, your red twig dogwood and your pussy willow is probably going to be the best. That's why I call them like the emergency trees. So if anything happens, we go cut those and stick in the creek to try to slow some erosion down. But that's the intentional planted multifunctional buffers that we have at Catawba. And I'll stop there, and I'll turn it back over to John to talk about some of those tools that we use to establish some of those plots.
Thanks, Adam. I mean, I'm looking at the time, and it's the ultimate cliffhanger, right? We've got about eight minutes left. As you can tell, we've got a lot to say. We've got a lot more to share. I think in the interest of time, I might just try and wrap it up, not with slides, but just a couple points. And I don't know, I mean, maybe I go ahead and make the plug now for the workshop, and Amber can share the details in the chat or something along those lines if you're not aware of it already. But if you want to come out and see these things in person, walk and talk with Adam and me, then make a point to attend that event. And it's about, I guess, maybe 2/3 of a day or so with some lunch. So we'll be able to go out and take a look at these things in person. I do want to say that a key driver in a lot of the work, or funder, has been the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which I know has been generous to Amber's organization. And so the tie-in and link couldn't be better, to be honest with you. I mean, the work we did there, which was test bedding some of this, which was trying to explore how these systems work, at their core, and can work on a farm from an operational standpoint, but also how they can fit into Virginia's nutrient credit trading program. And we don't have time to go into a lot of detail about that right now, but that program has been active since 2009, and there are, I think, at this point in time, maybe 130 plus facilities around the state that are converting open lands into areas that have some other type of use that's more, I guess, aligned with the conservation objectives, environmental objectives that DEQ is looking at with respect to water quality. But the rub has been that they've primarily been pine plantings at high tree densities. So if anybody can remember, like in the 2000s, when we had the foods versus fuels debate, right? So there were the biofuels in the Midwest. It was like, do we want to just, plant corn to create ethanol, or do we want to plant corn to, have food? This system, nutrient credit trading in Virginia, oftentimes is defined by agricultural retirement, meaning that a lot of pine trees are planted in open lands that, you know, at the densities they're planting, prevent agriculture. Well, I think you get a sense from the agroforestry model that what we're looking at is lower density tree plantings in strategic places to achieve those conservation benefits, but not retire agriculture. Because, I mean, that's a working farm you're looking at. I don't know if you were able to see, but like when Adam had the aerial image of the floral planting, you could see the field. That's an annual field. I mean, they're growing chilies, broccoli. They're doing, heritage varieties of maize. There's beans. You know, there's an annual farming happening there, but it's kind of bounded and wrapped by this perennial system that, you know, achieves a good conservation benefit and should be better recognized in the nutrient credit trading program. So that's one thing we did, and I can talk more about that. We're on the farm. The other thing too is the variable density. You know, I kind of showed some arrows sweeping across the landscape about where water moves and all those types of things. We got to look at the ratio, and I think that will maybe move us into a new era with respect to how we design our buffers. And we've looked at a little bit of that at Catawba, the variable density or variable width plantings, where we're planting greater densities or numbers in areas where we know the threat is, using models, landscape models that can tell you kind of where the water's moving, and we're pulling back in other areas. And that can have implications in terms of the costs. They also have implications in terms of being more efficient with your conservation. So I'll leave it at that. We've got more to talk about. If you're interested, please come on out.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam and John. I'm super excited about getting out there. The date is June 26th. It's from 9 to 1. Let me see if they put it in we'll put it in the chat box. Closing thoughts on that. Definitely register if you'd like to come out. And second thing I wanted to plug was our James River Buffer program. It is eligible to anyone in that area that you see on the map. So it's available in the Middle and Upper James watersheds, and it's a program that James River Association serves as the kind of coordinator for it, but we also have partners. Chesapeake Bay Foundation is the folks you'd be working with in the Upper James, and then it's us and Department of Forestry in the Middle James that you'd be working through. And this program covers 100% of the cost to install riparian forest buffers on properties in that eligible area. And that 100% covers site preparation, the labor and materials to install it, as well as 3 years of establishment, which Adam mentioned as the crucial years. And we agree, which is why we cover those 3 years of helping out the landowner. So definitely share that. And let me stop sharing my screen because I can't see faces. I know it's almost 7. Adam and John, if people have questions, could y'all stay on till 7:10, or do y'all have dinner plans and wanting to hop off?
I could do it.
Okay.
I can hang on.
All right. So folks, if you want to get off at 7, feel free. Other folks, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself and ask on your own as well.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you, Mary.
Hi, I'm Mary Hill, and I'm from Suffolk, Virginia, and I'm a water woman. I'm a 7th generation of harvesting oysters. I'm the first female in my family, but for this presentation, the property where we live, there's a buffer behind us that it has access to the waterways, but not by boat, but because there's a marsh that separate us, the buffer, then the marsh, and then the Nansemond River. But the buffer, there's a significant amount of erosion. There's a ravine there, but there's this buffer, and it's about 1 acre, and it's eroding it's overwhelming, and I don't know what to do. I did contact the Army Corps of Engineers, and one of their representatives, Susan Connors, had came out. They had took photos, and this has been about 5 years ago, 4 to 5 years ago. So, you know, and it has erosion, you know, is compounding. And so I'm hoping that, you know, someone could be able to, I don't know if this James River Buffer Program could be able to help. I'm a full-time caregiver. As you see, that lady there is my 100-year-old mother. So I take care of my mom full-time. And, but I also try to, you know, carry on the legacy of harvesting oysters. And we do have a few acres of oyster beds. Well, we have quite a bit of oyster beds in the Naspa River, but in particular, we do have oyster beds that are at the foot of where, there's the buffer and then the marsh and then the Naspa River is right there. So we do have oyster beds right there at the foot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mary, if the buffer program doesn't go down that far, but we do have, well, we have a living shoreline program that we're doing down there. And the Soil and Water Conservation District is who I would probably connect you with down there. If I give you, I will put my email in the chat and feel free to email me if you can after this, and I can try to connect you with somebody to help you out.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
I wanted to add too, that the Virginia Department of Forestry, they actually have riparian buffer kits that you can get. I think they have a species selection. They may be able to match it to your area. And I don't think I don't know if they're free or they're really cost reduced as a possibility. But like I mentioned that, you know, these are living kind of dynamic ecosystems, right? And so even at Catawba, we have to go back in and do supplemental plantings because certain things fail. We have mortality on trees, you know, so we're always kind of keeping an eye on those things and trying to get back in and repair where we can. And I don't know about your access to that area and you know, what kind of domain you have there, but you know, you can get some of potentially the right types of tree species from the Department of Forestry at low to no cost to plant back in, which could then help maybe stabilize a little bit more.
Okay, thank you.
Could I ask a question? Are you taking climate change into account when you're planning in, for example, selection of species and allowing for more intense precipitation events and more flooding and so on, as you plan the buffers?
Yeah, thanks, Judy. I responded, and I mean, there are some publications that have come out by the Forest Service that kind of project, and I hate to say it this way, climate losers and climate winners when it comes to species. So, but we are keeping an eye on that. But I will tell you one thing that we were intentional about from the beginning, which I think works in our favor with respect to climate, is that we focused on native species, and we really tried to keep kind of the you know, pure species composition. There are some varieties, but like primarily wild types, and a lot of the persimmon I think we're working with are wild type. I mean, it's an important question, and one that we need to keep an eye on. And I think we do that, but we've also been intentional about the native, which I think is a bit of a feather in the cap regarding. Now, we couldn't do that with the florals. That was a different story. But with our fruit and nut trees, those are all native, endemic to the region. And I think because of that, they're naturally buffered anyway from some, you know, pathogens and pests and those types of things, but potentially could be more suitable to weather some of the climatic changes that are forthcoming. But I mean, it's a great point, and I think that, you know, any kind of buffer design needs to be obviously looking at that. But I think, yeah, we were more intentional around the native species just because we felt like, hey, if we're going to put stuff out and plant this, and just given the spirit of the Catawba farm too, make sure that those species are our preferred selection.
Okay,
I don't know if Adam, yeah. But thanks for bringing that up, Judy. It's a good point.
Mine's not really a question. It's not fully formed yet, but the point you made about the importance of nutrition during like the first 3 years, and the chicken tractor. I love that idea, especially for some of the smaller properties that we're doing buffers on that aren't a huge scale farm, but interested in just hearing other techniques that y'all have used or heard of for small scale buffers or large scale in terms of like adding those nutrients during that phase. Does that make sense?
One that's not very popular, but is very like used, I mean, popular socially, but is used quite commonly in tree establishment, early tree establishment, is herbicide treatments, glyphosate, a 2-foot ring around the tree. We've also been, we've looked at some other tree stuff with cardboard. We've been getting cardboard from like Kroger or something. And then we put about a 2-foot square of cardboard at the bottom of the tree and then mulch on top of that. That seems to keep the weed suppression down while that mulch is fixing some kind of organic matter breakdown at the same time. And then like, yeah, the mowing at a time where you're collecting lots of organic matter, you know, and just like shooting like little tiny shards with the finishing mower and laying that down. Those are the ones I've done, as well as the chicken tractor. I'm going to experiment with a turkey tractor, and in my farm, we did a riparian. It's next to the creek, but it's up on a slope. So we just did a regular fruit orchard of apples and pears and stuff, about 100 and some trees. And I'm experimenting with running turkeys through them, and I have all the trees protected, you know, with tubes and whatnot. But yeah, also with the tubes, I would say, you know, if you can put tubes in and graze around. It might be more of an upland setting, but you know, depending on what animal you're grazing, there's these cages you can stick around them. We've experimented with barbed wire, keeping cattle off of them. I just do these little 3-panel cages and with sheep and goats, and that keeps them off of them. Biggest problem is my guardian dogs like chewing the tubes off and stuff. But I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I did. I was just curious about that. Thanks. See if there's any other questions in here. Gail, Roanoke, is that part of the buffer area? If you go to jamesriverbuffer.org, there's a eligibility map that you can type in an address and see if it falls into that boundary. There's some areas of the watershed that are like really like parts of a locality are in the watershed and parts aren't. So I would recommend pulling up an address on that jamesriverbuffers.org website to see. Let's see if there's anything else. Let's see any others. And Rusty's point, thanks for coming out and volunteering with us. And the alternative tree, different tubes. I'm assuming you're talking about the vented ones. We've used those on a few projects, but not on all of them. So that's definitely something we can continue to experiment with down here in the Middle James with those tree tubes.
You know, one interesting observation, again, a lot of this is observational, but Adam pointed out that wetland area where the big blue stem was coming in, some of the like warm season native grasses, and you know, deer browse is a really a big problem for a lot of these projects. And some of the trees in there, because, and like you mentioned, the kind of sequencing, which is also an agroforestry strategy, just thinking about phenology and, you know, how things are happening over time of a growing season or over multiple years and who's demanding what on which resource and that kind of thing. But those grasses, their legacy, because of an earlier project, the coming up, some of those trees that aren't tubed at all they're doing great, because there is a visual obstruction and a physical obstruction for deer. At least that's the theory. Their vision is terrible, and anything kind of moving around, you know, steers them away. And so that area is protected, and it's like there was no video. There was not a lot of site prep going on there either. It's just kind of like Adam said, plant, let's see what happens. And those are some of the best performing trees in the buffer area, just, you know, with that complementarity of those grasses growing together in that setting. It was kind of an interesting observation, because some of the other areas where it's like, oh, we're going to strip and spray and all of that, like, you know, thistle and all kinds of problems are happening with competition, and those are really impacting the trees as opposed to being symbiotic.
Any other questions or comments from folks? And if you think of them later, feel free to send them along. I'll be sending out a thank you email to folks. So if you have something that came to mind later, feel free to reply with your question and we'll try to get an answer to it. Thanks, Adam and John. And thanks, folks, for joining us. And they put the link in there. Please share the event on June 26th out at Catawba. It's $10. But you do get a lunch from the Roanoke Co-op just down the street, and it's from 9 to 1. Thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.